Darkcast Network, bringing our indie podcasts out of the shadows. In April 1991, Margaret and Jim Watson lived in a tenement flat in Denniston, in the East End of Glasgow, along with their 16-year-old daughter Diane and 15-year-old son Alan. While being a happy, close-knit family, they did struggle financially, following Jim being made redundant 2 years prior, and only being able to find casual work since, and Margaret working part-time as a school dinners attendant. And so, wanting to help out, Diane took a part-time job working for a few hours after school on Tuesdays, Thursdays and all day on Saturdays. Diane also volunteered as a youth leader at a local toddlers group on Tuesdays after finishing her part-time job, and she was also involved with pre-vocational training at a local hospital. On the morning of Wednesday the 10th of April 1991, it would just have been like any other school day as Diane headed from the family home to the nearby Whitehill Secondary School, where she was a hard-working and popular pupil. As the bell for the morning break rang, Diane, her friends and fellow pupils headed out of the school building for a bit of fresh air, and just so happened to go towards the area that was overlooked by the flat where Diane lived. However, as she walked outside with her friends, she was approached by Barbara Glover, a fellow pupil. While Diane attempted to ignore Barbara and walked away, Barbara persisted, and a brief altercation took place, before Barbara produced a kitchen knife and proceeded to stab Diane in the liver and heart. Despite everything happening so quickly and Diane and her friends being in shock, Diane's friends quickly rushed to her aid, witnessing Diane pull the large knife from her body before becoming unsteady on her feet. As Diane lived so close and her friends knew her parents would be home, they carried Diane to her home. Diane's mum and dad were in shock at the sight of their daughter covered in blood and immediately called for an ambulance. However, unfortunately, help wouldn't come in time, and Diane died in the arms of her parents. On the 26th of July 1991, Barbara Glover, aged 15, was at the High Court in Glasgow to hear her sentence after being found guilty of an unprovoked assault on Diane on the 9th of April 1991 and the murder of Diane on the 10th of April 1991, for which she was ordered to be detained without limit of time. Following the trial, Margaret and Jim Watson and their son Alan tried to move on with their lives, with friends, relatives, school staff and the wider community of Denniston giving what help and comfort they could to the shattered family following Diane's murder. However, in August 1991, journalist Jack McLean wrote an article for the then Glasgow Herald under the pen name The Urban Voltaire about the murder of Diane Watson by Barbara Glover, although their names had been changed. In the article, he highlighted the situation where child murderers are detained without limit of time in Scotland. However, he went on to imply that Diane had looked down on and saw herself better than Barbara, regarding her with disdain due to having come from an upper working-class background, going on to state that she had the smart white socks of the daughter of the Labour Party aristocracy. The article also appeared to condone Barbara Glover's behaviour, suggesting that carrying knives was an acceptable part of working-class culture, and it was an incident that could have happened anywhere where class and territory were important. However, Diane's death was not a sudden murder committed in anger, but was unprovoked and planned, with friends having been told by Barbara that she was going to attack Diane, and she had actually assaulted Diane the day before she murdered her. Jack McLean then wrote a second article in June 1992, where he repeated the same suggestion of the murderer and victim being distinguished by their class, and tried to gain sympathy for Barbara Glover by comparing her case to another, where the case of a middle-class student accused of stabbing was found to be not proven, which means there was not enough evidence for a guilty verdict. The Watson family knew these articles could not be further from the truth regarding their background, with Margaret Watson having been brought up in the Gorbals and her husband been brought up in Easterhouse, both working-class areas around Glasgow. And at the time of Diane's murder, the family were struggling financially due to their working situation and low income, and had only just been managing to keep a roof over their heads, which undoubtedly made them working class. But regardless of their social background, how did this justify one person taking another life? In addition to this article, a story about the case also featured in Marie Claire magazine by Meg Henderson in September 1992, titled "British Children Serving Life Sentences," which mirrored Jack McLean's article. But as heartbreaking for the family as these articles were, they would suffer even more unimaginable tragedy. On the 5th of December 1992, nearly 18 months after the Watson family's lives had been shattered by the murder of Diane, sadly Diane's brother Alan took his own life at the age of 16. Alan was found in his bedroom clutching copies of the articles that had been written about the death of his sister, one from Marie Claire magazine by Meg Henderson and 2 others from the Glasgow Herald written by Jack McLean. And Alan's parents were convinced that these articles had directly contributed to the untimely death of their son, as this had caused him to suffer even more following losing his sister, making him ultimately feel that he just couldn't take any more. Michael Martin, Labour Party MP at the time for the nearby district Springburn, was critical of Jack McLean and the articles that had been written, and he raised this in the House of Commons. He also exchanged letters with Jack McLean, accusing him of being ill-informed. Jack McLean had asserted that his articles were based upon discussions he had had with professional people related to the Watson family, including doctors and teachers. However, the doctors and teachers involved gave written testimony that they had in fact never spoken to Jack McLean, and none of the Watson family's neighbours had spoken to the press either. Criticism was also directed towards an interview in Marie Claire magazine, which was said to have been carried out with Barbara Glover, whose name was changed to Jean. The interview was said to have taken place in the detention unit Barbara was being held in, following permission being given by the then Director of Strathclyde Regional Council Social Work Department. However, Lord James Douglas Hamilton, the Scottish Office Minister, as well as the Strathclyde Regional Social Work Department, denied that any such interview had taken place, going on to say that they would not even be in a position to grant any such permission with any individuals who were minors. Although Meg Henderson, who wrote the Marie Claire article, continued to insist that the interview had taken place between herself and Barbara and that she was given permission. Alan Watson's funeral was held on the 11th of December 1992, and unbelievably Jack McLean published another article that very day, where he again reinforced the misleading impression he made regarding Diane's murder. He also attacked Michael Martin, the Labour MP, in the article, accusing him and Scottish Office Minister Lord James Douglas Hamilton of hiding behind parliamentary privilege and trying to deny journalists free speech. Margaret and Jim had hoped that they would be left alone on the day of their son Alan's funeral, but no. It was stated that neither Jack McLean or any of the editors of the Glasgow Herald had been aware that Alan had even died, despite this fact having apparently been reported on TV and in numerous other newspapers. Understandably, Jim and Margaret, following their 16-year-old daughter being murdered and dying in their arms, and their 15-year-old son Alan taking his own life in distress at losing his sister and no doubt other factors, following burying their son, there was a further decline in their health, with it being suspected that Jim may have already suffered a heart attack following finding his son, and Margaret was admitted into hospital. So understandably, a short amount of time passed before they felt able to continue their fight, but fight they had to do. Upon being discharged from hospital, although still obviously trying to cope with the murder and death of both of their children, Jim and Margaret Watson requested a meeting with Jack McLean and his then editor Arnold Kemp. Although they would not secure this basic respect until they had stood outside of the Glasgow Herald newspaper offices for 6 weeks with a banner. And then, not surprisingly, they left this meeting very unsatisfied and feeling like they were no further forward, They were certainly not going to get an apology, as it was clear that neither Jack McLean or his editor had any remorse or regret about the articles, no matter what it had led to. There's a whole document which includes a transcript of some of the conversation that took place at the meeting, as well as transcripts of phone conversations and other documentation that you can find a link to in the show notes if you would like to find out more. With Jim and Margaret Watson having suffered severe loss, distress, and blow after blow, yet more was still to come. It would only be 8.5 years into Barbara Glover's sentence when a parole hearing by a designated tribunal was convened by the Parole Board for Scotland, led by Sheriff Brian Lockhart, was held in 2000. The tribunal studied reports from staff at the prison and from social workers, as well as psychological and psychiatric reports. It also studied submissions and materials provided by Diane's parents. Although the tribunal stated they fully appreciated the depths of the family's feelings in opposing Barbara Glover's release and appreciated the devastating effect the murder of Diane had had on the family's lives, after considering the submissions and representations made, the tribunal concluded it was no longer necessary for the protection of the public that Barbara, who was now aged 24, remain confined, and she was to be released on life licence. Jim and Margaret Watson were shattered by the decision, with Margaret Watson stating, "We are just so heartbroken and stunned today, we can't speak about it. We promised our children we would seek justice, but that seems impossible now. The system has let us down. Barbara Glover has shown no remorse since killing our daughter." Sheriff Brian Lockhart, who led the tribunal, explained that recent changes in the law had designated Barbara's sentence to at least be 7 years by the Lord Justice General, Lord Roger, and they were only considering whether Barbara should be kept in prison for the protection of the public, and it was not to consider whether she had served enough time in prison. Lindsay McIntosh, a member of the Scottish Parliament and the Conservative Party Deputy Home Affairs spokesperson at the time, said, "This is a desperate situation. I do not think the family will ever get over this. When people are sentenced without limit of time, that is exactly what it should mean." However, instead, Barbara walked free after murdering 16-year-old Diane Watson on school ground a mere 8.5 months later, where she then began to study to become a beauty therapist. 20 years after the death of Diane Watson and the suicide of her brother Alan, their mother, Margaret Watson, gave evidence at the Levinson inquiry in 2011, which was a judicial public inquiry into the ethics of the British press. Margaret and her husband, Jim Watson, also gave written statements to the committee. They spoke of the anger they felt from the portrayal of Barbara Glover being the victim in Jack McLean's article in the Glasgow Herald and the Marie Claire article by Meg Henderson. Margaret Watson stated, "Journalists should have all the facts and not cause other tragedies to take place," referring to the death of her son Alan. And she was also critical of Jack McLean using Diane's case to spearhead a campaign into the treatment of young offenders, especially as he had implied Diane had looked down on Barbara with disdain and that they were from different social backgrounds, which, as we have learned, could not be further from the truth. She went on to say that Jack McLean knew absolutely nothing about the case. He simply didn't like the idea that 15-year-old Barbara Glover had been given a life sentence for murdering their 16-year-old daughter Diane. The publishers of the now Herald newspaper, which was formed following the takeover of the Glasgow Herald, stated they deeply regretted any action that had added to the Watson family's grief over the tragic loss of their daughter and later their son, although added that the columns were published some 20 years ago when the group was under different ownership and editorial control, and the freelance journalist involved had not worked for the company for some years, referring to Jack McLean, who has never apologised for what he had written, and neither had the Glasgow Herald themselves. Marie Claire magazine stated, "A subsequent meeting with Mrs. Watson led Marie Claire to publish a clarification in April 1993, apologising clearly for the family's distress as a result of the original article and explaining the background to the sources used. But it took Marie Claire over a year to issue an apology for their article." Margaret Watson felt that the Press Complaints Commission, paid for by some of the very newspapers that published articles that were misleading about her daughter, should be replaced by a completely independent body or tribunal. Jim Watson told the inquiry, "Just because a person has died, their reputation doesn't die with them. They shouldn't be besmirched at the will of a sick journalist." According to an article in the Guardian newspaper in November 2011, a close friend of Jack McLean said that Jack had not been warned in advance that he would be named during the Levinson hearings and that he may seek legal advice, going on to say that he's in a bit of a state of shock and he's quite upset. Margaret Watson also campaigned to change libel laws to protect the reputation of the dead, as currently the law does not protect the reputation of the dead, so they cannot be defamed. This law allowed for articles such as those about the tragic death of Diane Watson, which twisted the facts and may have contributed to the death of her brother Alan, which a change in the law could have prevented. After Jim and Margaret Watson had lost their daughter to murder and their son through taking his own life following the murder of his sister, despite the new law now determining that if a child or juvenile is jailed without limit of time, that their maturing has to be taken into account, and they deserve to know how much of a sentence they will have to serve, instead of it just being without limit of time, with it then being determined that all the time Barbara should have to serve was a minimum of 7 years. Do you agree with the change in law? The ethics of covering murders is definitely something that Scottish Murders takes very seriously. And while the podcast does sadly cover many different murders that have taken place in Scotland, we do always strive to be as respectful and sensitive as possible, not just in regards to the victims of murder, but also their families and those who knew and loved them.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.